welcome along everyone to this online learning today with CILIPS Scotland. We're really pleased to have you all here. So just by way of introduction and a bit of housekeeping. So first of all, this is the launch of the outputs of the Reveal project. Some of the housekeeping for today, just to ask you to stay on mute unless speaking. Up to you if you leave your cameras on or off. We've got a very short part of the event where there will be a little bit of interaction, so you may want to put your camera on for that. But if any of you are not in a position to turn your camera on or even your mics, please just no pressure to do that, but please do engage with the discussion if you can. If you do have any questions throughout David's talk, then please just use the chat function if you can. Raise your hand if any urgent problems, but preferably put any questions in the chat. We can come to them at the end, and I'll keep a note for them. So put your questions in there at any time. We have captions enabled, but you should be able to toggle them on and off at the bottom should you need them. I'm Sean McNamara from CILIPS Scotland, and we also have Leah Higgins here, who is also part of the CILIPS Scotland team and will be here to help with anything you need. Okay, without further ado, I'm just going to introduce our speaker today. Many of you will know Dr David McMenemy. David is Senior Lecturer in Information Studies at the University of Glasgow and has over 20 years' experience in academia, including the University of Strathclyde, where he taught both myself and perhaps some of the others on here, and spent 15 years working in public libraries before that. David is a former trustee and board member of CILIP, the UK-wide CILIP, and his research interests encompass information law and ethics, intellectual freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of access to information, digital citizenship, privacy, and the philosophy of information. And David has also extensively researched around public library policy and development in the UK. The webinar today will look at Reveal, which we were delighted to fund via the CILIPS Research Fund in 2022. I'll not say much more about it, as David will cover it in the talk, but it's a hugely welcome piece of work, and I urge everyone to engage with it today and beyond this, and promote it as much as possible, because it is really a piece of work that has come at a time where it has never been more important. So David, over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks everyone for coming along today. It's amazing to see so many people here, and I hope you'll find the presentation useful and the interactive part enjoyable and informative. So what I'm going to do today is introduce, obviously, the resources. Given it's over 4 hours worth of content, I'll obviously just be taking little snapshots of the resources that I've developed, but just to give you a flavour of how they're going to work and how I would hope you would want to engage with them and use them. So, overview of the session. I'm going to highlight the motivations for the project at the beginning. So why did I want to do this project? Introduce some of the materials with some excerpts, as I said. And I'm going to give you a little exercise in dealing with controversial materials later on in the presentation. And I've hopefully left lots and lots of time and space for questions, discussions, because obviously some of you won't have seen the material yet. Most of you won't have seen the material yet. So really get your questions on it and how you might want to interpret it, use it, and I'm happy to answer any questions in that regard as well from you. So in terms of the project title, acronyms, we love acronyms in higher education, but the Reveal project, it stands for Reinforcing Ethics and Values for Effective Advocacy for Libraries. And the aim, when I wrote the proposal for CILIPS Research Fund, was to enhance collective advocacy across the profession through an accessible framework for library and information ethics and values, presented as a set of continuing professional development tools, which key emphasis on this being that they're free. So all of the materials I'm going to talk about today will be free for anyone to use. Leah and Sean and Kirsten have made a fantastic website to make them all available free to use. So they're there for everyone to use at any time you want to interact with them. So there's no cost involved. So what was my motivation for the project? Well, the why of what we do as a profession and the ethical framework that guides that practice, I think it's crucial to facilitate an understanding within the public of why libraries matter. So we're always on the defensive here, I think, about why libraries matter and trying to convince people that libraries matter. In actual fact, we have a fantastic ethical framework that underpins that, but also the kind of key library thinkers that have discussed all of these issues over the years. We really have a lot to build our arguments on, but rarely we use these frameworks and these resources to build that argument. So for me, we have core values that really are at the heart of being a citizen in a modern democracy. So things like freedom of access to information, freedom of expression, promoting tolerance and democratic values, as well as things like information on data privacy, which are obviously in our wheelhouse as well. But these are all essentially fundamental human rights that libraries exist to essentially promote and empower people within those rights. And often I think sometimes the advocacy doesn't quite get to the heart of that. So for me, it was about trying to kind of put together a collection of materials that helped people engage with those debates a little bit more freely than perhaps they could before. So key question for me really was the workforce regularly able to engage with these vital debates? And obviously, if you're not engaging with them, it becomes, in my view, more difficult to articulate them. So the obvious place where people would encounter these kind of debates is library skills. So certainly, I taught ethics and values to my students and still do, but a lot of library skills don't necessarily teach them and might not teach them in the same way. So even assuming everyone who went to library school covered ethics and values and ethical frameworks, only 51% of UK library information workforce holds a professional library degree, and only 43% have worked towards qualifications provided by CILIP, such as chartership and fellowship. So there's a huge chunk of the workforce, I think, that perhaps aren't engaging with these debates. They'll think about them, they'll have their own views on them, but they're not perhaps being given the opportunity to really engage with others and do that dialogue with people and iron these issues out, I think. So for me, that was one of the main motivators. And also another key motivator for me is that I believe advocacy is everyone's responsibility. So evidence suggests that sectors cannot solely rely on professional bodies to do their advocacy for them. So a quote there from a paper in a 2018 study, 50 different policy areas across Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK. It was found that the extent to which an advocate's chances of preference attainment increases with public support depends on the number of advocates lobbying on an issue. And essentially what that means is, if you're relying on one single source, you're hoping that they get it right, you're hoping that they'll listen to, whereas if we're collectively doing this advocacy around the key themes that we believe in, then for me, I think there's much more chance of us actually being listened to and actually creating this kind of culture where these values are constantly talked about and constantly promoted by all of us. So in terms of ethical values and library information work, well, providing them this opportunity for engagement with ethics and values really is something that, as I said, all the workforce should be able to engage with. It can't simply be the preserve of professional levels of staff who perhaps get a qualification, or professional bodies, or even more importantly, something we reserve for conferences and articles. So it's something I think that we have to be doing on a daily basis with our colleagues, but with the tools to actually, facilitate those kind of discussions happening. So, broader aim, our advocacy should begin by being clear about what the ethics and values supporting the profession are, how widespread understanding of them is, and how they can be positively disseminated by all within the collective workforce for a consistent and effective advocacy programme. So I hope the materials I've created for this project can underpin library advocacy by providing a professional development framework for the engagement with and dissemination of the ethics and values of the profession. So one of the hopes I have, for instance, is that if you're going for certification or chartership or fellowship, that you can perhaps put down engagement with these materials as part of your professional development for the year. That would be, for me, a success if that happens. So really boiling all this down into the key themes that are pressing at the moment then. So what are the current concerns? Well, obviously censorship challenges to library collections and services is a big one. Privacy of users and use of digital services is a particular area that I'm interested in, of course. Misinformation and disinformation, and the thorny topic of neutrality, which I discuss in detail in the materials as well. Calls to decolonise our collections is obviously a major policy initiative at the moment. And also the cost of access to materials, so the ebook SOS campaign and the like. So, any one of these particular issues would be a bit of a challenge to deal with, but all of them together at the same time presents a significant challenge for our workforce to try and engage with people around essentially issues that are massive. Each one of them is massive. So I've tried to discuss all of them in the materials, some more than others, depending on, obviously, I was writing it during the summer when censorship was quite large in the mindset, but hopefully you'll find a treatment of all of them in the materials. So in terms of the outputs, before I move on to some of the content, first, the major piece of the output is actually the literature review. So there are 10 videos that go along with that, but the literature review took me the longest amount of time, so it's something like 35,000 words. And it's published open source, it's 70 pages. And that's there for you to dip into whenever you want to. So it covers all of the materials that are in the videos. The videos are based on the lit review, but it's really there for you to, you can dip into it at any point. You don't have to have read one section to have read another section. And as I say, linked to that are the 10 videos on key issues such as values-based advocacy, ethics and ethical theories, as well as particular library issues like privacy, freedom of expression, and the like. I've also created a few infographics on value themes, which again are available to download for free. And at the same time, I also conducted a survey of the Scottish library community on ethics and advocacy, and one of the videos actually summarises those findings. And so the key point at the bottom there, all materials are free to use on a Creative Commons license. The link is there for you to access them. I think Sean's going to email round that to everyone afterwards as well. But really, please do utilise the materials, share them amongst your networks and the like. So, say the lit review is 70 pages. It's a review of key themes in advocacy, ethics, ethical theories, and library and information ethics. But it also leads on to practical advice on how to address contentious issues around library ethics. So, the grounding is what is advocacy? That's the starting point. How do we do advocacy more broadly before I talk about libraries? Then I move on to talk about ethical theories, and then how these apply within libraries, how they've been interpreted by library thinkers, before moving on to talk about some specific concerns like censorship and privacy, intellectual property rights and the like. So there's a range there of discussions. Starts at the higher level of what these broad themes mean generally, before I can drill down into the library side of things. So the themes of the videos, well, the first one is what is advocacy? So we explore what advocacy is, which I'll talk about in a second, and when I highlight some of the materials. The second video talks about ethical theories generally, and then moves on to talk about key ethical thinkers in libraries. The third video unpacks a little the CILIPS ethical framework and what that might mean for practice. The fourth talks about ethics, privacy, and libraries. The fifth on freedom of expression in libraries, obviously a very thorny issue at the moment. So in that video, I've tried to unpack what the main arguments for freedom of expression versus the arguments for limiting freedom of expression, so you can get a fuller understanding if you've not been exposed to that. Then I move on to ethics and information organisation, so how we catalogue and classify materials from an ethical standpoint, before talking about intellectual property. And then video 8 talks about some of the more contemporary ethical concerns, so we use specific examples in that video, what's happening at the moment. The 9th video is the summary of the survey I mentioned, the experiences of the Scottish Library workforce. And the last video brings together all of the discussions in the previous videos to be more practical in terms of showing you how all of these theories come together and how you can apply them within your own practice. I'll pause to make sure there's no questions that are urgent. Are we okay there?
Yep, no.
Nothing at the moment, Sean? Okay, cool. Good. Right, so I'll move on. So the infographics, there's a handful of infographics. I tried to extract what I thought would be practically useful ones. So 3 of them could work quite well, I think, as bookmarks. So I've extracted Gorman's 8 Enduring Values, Ranganathan's 5 Laws of Library Science, as well as the one on the far right, which talks about rhetoric and library advocacy, so how you would use the kind of different techniques of rhetoric to apply within libraries. I've also pulled a couple of quotes which are kind of quite well used, but I think are quite useful. So hopefully the infographics you could print out and put in your workplace, or probably 3 of them will work well as bookmarks, as I said. But entirely up to you how you want to use them. They're free for you to use in a non-commercial setting. So I've extracted some of the content just to show you, kind of give you a flavour of it. Key point is obviously I want to get your feedback on today and your ideas on a lot of the issues. So I'm only going to cover small parts of it because there's over 4 hours of video content and a 70-page discussion of all these issues. But hopefully what I'm going to cover will give you a flavour of what's in the actual materials themselves. So as I said, I start off talking about what advocacy is, and essentially it's the art of persuasion. So as I said, if we arrive at the conclusion that advocacy is about persuading people in terms of your cause or your argument, then the concept of persuasion and how we do that becomes vital. And this places us in the theoretical area known as rhetoric, which Cambridge Dictionary defines as speech or writing intended to be effective and influence people. And what's important here is the context of an argument. So the social context of an argument can be visualized as a triangle with interrelated points labeled message, writer, speaker, and audience. And I utilize within these materials the book by Ramage, Bean and Johnson, which is about writing arguments using rhetoric techniques. And they call that the rhetorical triangle. And they say when you alter one point of the triangle, for example, when you change the audience for whom you're writing, you often need to alter the other points by restructuring the message itself, and perhaps by changing the tone or image you project as writer-speaker. So it's important to point out, though, that Ramage, Bean and Johnson are essentially just building on classical philosophy. So what we're talking about here essentially is the art of rhetoric that Aristotle proposed. And massively influential book, The Art of Rhetoric, and even now we still use it. So Aristotle discussed three key elements which are similar to the triangle that Ramage, Bean and Johnson talk about. So we have ethos, pathos, and logos. And a fourth element which sits outside of that, which relates to the context, opportunity, or moment, kairos. And that's also an important aspect of rhetoric. And I'll talk about all of these a little bit later. One tool I highlight quite significantly in the materials is called the scale of resistance tool, and this is what I'll get you to play with a little bit later. And this is a tool that Ramage, Bean and Johnson argue is really effective for planning in advance any initiatives you're doing, so that you're aware of any potential objections that might come in. Because they say, quote directly from the book, "Seldom will you encounter an issue in which the range of disagreement follows a simple line from accord to resistance. Often resistant views fall into different categories, so that no single line of argument appeals to all those whose views are different from your own. You have to identify not only your audience's resistance to your ideas, but also the causes of that resistance." And that's my highlight and underline, because I think that's important. So understanding why people are objecting and being able to deal with that's very important. Now, often it has to be said, sometimes they're objecting for reasons that we shouldn't support, but also quite often people are objecting out of things like fear, misunderstanding, etc. And it's important as professionals we're able to compartmentalize those different approaches, because some people can be engaged with. Those who can't, then absolutely we shouldn't, once we know that they can't be engaged with. But a lot of people who object to some of the things that we do are really just often seeking reassurance, seeking clarity, seeking evidence that what you're doing actually is going to work. So the scale of resistance tool works essentially like this. It's a table, and it goes from one end, which is accord, through neutrality, undecided, to the other end, which is resistance. What it asks you to do is, if you're planning anything, write down the arguments that you could interpret that you might receive for the initiative. So in the materials themselves, for instance, in the final chapter and in the final video, I utilise this tool to try and formulate some of the objections you might get to Drag Queen Story Hours, and to be able to understand how to advocate to different audiences around a programme that runs Drag Queen Story Hours. So it's a useful exercise because it allows you to kind of put yourself in other people's minds, and also actually understand where some of the objections might come from that are in good faith, as opposed to those that come from bad faith. So I say we'll use this tool a little bit later. We'll put you into Zoom room so you can have a play with this tool, see what you think. But ultimately, I think it's an extremely useful tool. When I was doing that exercise for the materials, it actually was good to try and think about all the potential objections. I mean, there's 5 categories essentially, but there may be multiple more objections in that, or supportive versus resistant approaches that you have to advocate around. So it's a useful tool for planning in that way. Now, I also discussed things like how different arguments work. So one-sided arguments versus arguments to people who are undecided. So obviously one-sided arguments are extremely common in terms of advocacy, especially I think in librarianship, because often we are putting out messages that we know will be well received by large portions of the audience. So one-sided arguments are useful. They can be hugely effective in keeping people who believe in our cause motivated and ready for action. But one of the big challenges that we have is not appealing to people who are completely opposed to us. It's appealing to people who might be undecided or neutral around an issue. As Ramage, Bean and Johnson say, in-group appeals that motivate an already supportive audience can repel a neutral or undecided audience. So some of the messaging that we put across that might be kind of very happy clappy, talking about all the things that we love about libraries, might not be necessarily something that convinces someone who's in the middle. So again, we try and have to understand their position. They argue in the book, for instance, that undecided or neutral audiences can be considered as akin to jurors, contemplating all sides of an argument before deciding, but being highly resistant to any arguments that seek to demonise or caricature alternative viewpoints. And this part's really important. This idea that we don't paint people as villains, we discuss issues rationally and allow them people who are undecided, who could be supportive to us, to actually understand that we're dealing with things in good faith. So when you're advocating to undecided neutral audiences, it's normally built around what's often referred to as a classical argument. Again, this is another thing we can trace back to Aristotle, and something that's a core skill in rhetoric, and that means introducing your issue, problem or cause, presenting your case for that cause, addressing the opposition to your issue, problem or cause, providing your proof to support your own argument, and then presenting your conclusion. So that's the theory around it, and it's essentially the way that you would write a dissertation or an essay as well. It's similar in terms of structure. But again, I've pulled from the materials my summary of how this might work within practice. So the quotes are directly from Ramage, Bean and Johnson book. So in terms of summarising opposing views, this is something that can often get us into trouble, because often we might see an objection as being someone who's diametrically opposed, when actually the objection is something that could be countered. So their advice is follow the principle of charity, which obliges you to avoid loaded, biased or strawman summaries that oversimplify or distort opposing arguments, making them easier to knock over. So again, it's an easy mistake to make. If you make simplistic arguments against a case, then people can see that for what it is. In terms of refuting opposing views, you attempt to convince readers that the opposing view is logically flawed, inadequately supported, or based on erroneous assumptions. You can rebut, firstly, the writer's stated reason and grounds, and two, the writer's warrant and backing. What that means is, in ordinary language, is underlying assumptions that they're putting forward. In terms of rebutting evidence, now not all of these will apply in different contexts, but you can deny the truth of the data if it is inaccurate. You can cite counter examples and counter testimony. You can cast doubt on the representativeness or sufficiency of examples. You can cast doubt on the relevance or recency of the examples, stats or testimony. Call into question the credibility of the authority. Question the accuracy or context of quotations. And question the way the statistical data were produced or interpreted. And often, conceding to opposing views can be a good tactic if they are reasonable. You must sometimes concede to an opposing argument rather than refute it. And this often entails switching to an alternative field of values that's opposed to the one that you're actually refuting to argue your case. So that leads on to the topic of ethical frames, because switching values, switching frames is something that can be challenging. For instance, if you're arguing from a rights-based perspective and someone's arguing from an entirely different ethical perspective, it's difficult to meet in the middle. So it's important to be able to identify and understand the ethical frame that the person that you're trying to advocate to or argue with is actually occupying. So it's important to understand both of these from a CILIP perspective, but also these of key library thinkers. So I've discussed that in the materials. I won't go into detail on that today, but again, if you understand it from a theoretical perspective, the CILIP perspective, and also how key library thinkers have engaged with it, then I think you're on a good pathway to being able to do this effectively. So how have I broken that discussion up on ethical values in the materials themselves? Well, the first section discusses the ethical theories that predominate in society, and that's built on the framework discussed in Michael Sandel's book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. It's a fantastic book on political philosophy. And then I talk about ethics and ethical thinkers in library and information science. So the four authors I highlight are Ranganathan, Fosgate, Gorman, and Lankes, because what I tried to do was pull out essentially people who had formulated a philosophy of librarianship. So they're four of the main people that have done that. So in terms of the broader discussion around ethical theories in societies, Michael Sandel asks in his book a series of questions regarding social justice and the ethical frameworks that guide them, and the considerations of governments and citizens throughout the world. And obviously that thought process, those themes cascade down into professional ethics as well. So he asks, does a just society seek to promote the virtue of its citizens, or should law be neutral towards competing conceptions of virtue, so that citizens can be free to choose for themselves the best way to live? And essentially, Sandel suggests three approaches as containers to justice for the ethical approaches that predominate, and he argues these are firstly welfare, freedom, and virtue. So I unpack all of those and explore them later in terms of how they apply to libraries and library thinking. Key thing to note, though, is that tensions do exist. The three containers are useful for discussing what they mean, but they also cross over. So as Sandel says, you might say that ancient theories of justice start with virtue, while modern theories start with freedom. But he also concedes that this contrast can mislead. So we can all often see in arguments that are put to us values mixing between the three types. And that means understanding all three of them is absolutely vital to be able to engage with people. They might see people, for instance, posit what they say is a rights-based argument that's actually based on virtue. It's quite common to see that, especially around things like group rights. So it's important you to be able to understand what the different ethical frames are and how you can engage with them and understand them and be able to put your case forward in that language. So in reality, obviously, some of our debates reflect disagreement about what it means to maximise welfare or respect freedom or cultivate virtue. Others involve disagreement about what to do when these ideals conflict. Political philosophy can't resolve these disagreements once and for all, but it can give shape to the arguments we have and bring moral clarity to the alternatives we confront as democratic citizens. So that quote's from Sandell's book, but I think it beautifully encapsulates the issues we face as a workforce, because a lot of the arguments that we're facing are actually from these different ethical frames. So as I said, being able to understand them, I think puts you in a good position to be able to engage with people in a way that they can respect, and that allows you to get your message across in the way that's effective for you. And I then move on to talk about ethical codes and how these apply with social justice. Obviously, a lot of these ethical theories are what people study at things like the PPE degree at Oxford and at Harvard, etc. So people who become the rulers of democratic countries study all of these political philosophies in great detail. And what that means essentially is eventually they cascade down into policy. So it's really important that we're able to understand these. But obviously, ethics and values apply to everything we do as well. If you look at the PKSB wheel, for instance, ethics and values is at the core of it. So the idea is that ethics and values cascade out into every aspect of the PKSB and therefore what we do as professionals. So it's really important to be able to understand all of the different viewpoints on ethics and values. And I talk in detail on this in the materials, but I brought this slide out just to highlight to you CILIPS ethical principles. And just to give you an idea of the ethical frames, because obviously on its face, if you look at the 7 principles, it looks like it's very human rights based. So it's very based on the category that would be under for Sandell would be freedom. But you also see other categories in there that don't quite fit into that category. So public benefit is probably more one you could argue would be either welfare or virtue. There are crossovers. There are things you can identify as rights, for instance, so intellectual freedom, impartiality, confidentiality. These could be put under the rights category. But some of the others are actually more about long-term benefit. So public benefit preservation, for instance, aren't really essentially rights. They support rights, but as ethical values, they're much more about a collective societal focus rather than an individual one. So again, even here you see ethical frames colliding, which can be useful, but equally it's important to understand the differences, because even looking at category 1, human rights, equality and diversity, well, option number 4, intellectual freedom, is also human rights, so why would that not fit into number 1? Well, because it's something we want to kind of present as being particularly important for us alongside confidentiality, which obviously links with privacy. So even when we're laying out our own ethical principles, there are those clashes and conflations of ethical frames that we need to be able to get our head around and articulate. So going back to the theories of rhetoric that I mentioned earlier, so I've pulled out the different themes and give you an example of how I would interpret them in a general sense, and obviously this can let you think about how you might interpret them specifically. But the rhetorical theme, firstly, logos, which is the appeal to logic or reason. So it's basically how logical or how reasonable is your argument. Is it something that can be convincing? And how we would do that? We'll provide evidence, such as the type of stats that are recorded in things like banned book week, number of items challenged if it's about censorship, what's being challenged in terms of theme, result of challenges. And again, around censorship, you could use logos to reinforce the rights of a citizen to intellectual freedom. You could argue that argument. That's a reasonable argument that most people would understand. The potential risks of that, obviously evidence that we utilise must be accurate, up to date and understandable. The profession has to be consistent about how we apply these values, or logos overall is diminished. So if we have one particular group arguing for one point, other groups within librarianship arguing at cross purposes publicly, then that can mean the public get confused. So we do need some kind of way of arguing these points within our own community before we make them public. The policies that we write must support these advocacy claims. So if we're arguing that we are for intellectual freedom, then our policies need to support that, and they need to do it in detail so the public understand. There's also the dangers of overclaiming to credibility. So there's a paper, an article a few months back where someone stated that libraries never censor, which is, it's a nice soundbite. It's not really accurate. Libraries do censor sometimes for good reasons and bad reasons. Sometimes it's obviously based on things like age levels of materials, but equally other times it's because of current societal mores. So there are ways that we censor some things that are more acceptable than others, but to say we never censor just looks like a lazy argument. It's not convincing. Ethos relates to the appeal of the speaker. So again, who you get to argue a point around an issue is important. So again, using an example of censorship, using a respected celebrity or public persona, highlighting dangers of censorship from their own professional space is actually a good one. So someone famous saying, well, I made this film, I wrote this book, you would be able to see it if we censored around these different issues. But also, obviously, the professional body highlighting the importance of these things is important as well. And again, potential risks. Well, the profession must be consistent, again, about its application of values. And the spokesperson must have a broad appeal and not be someone who's unpopular or otherwise limited in public awareness. Otherwise, appeal is a one-sided argument of limited utility. Basically, only one particular group will listen to it, the rest won't. There was an issue around this which wasn't about librarianship, but a couple of years back, the Scottish Government hired a comedian to basically front their COVID campaign. And this particular comedian had a lot of people who liked them and a lot of people who didn't like them. And there was a lot of disquiet about, well, why did you choose this person? And actually, when you think about it from a rhetoric point of view, it's completely clear why they were the wrong person to do it. Because it was a message that you wanted to be universal, that person split opinion. Therefore, the message was not going to get across. So you have to think about who the spokespeople that you choose are, what their backgrounds are, and whether they're respected enough to get enough people across the line for your argument. And pathos, which is the appeal to emotion. Again, if we're using it for censorship, you can start to argue to the person's psychology. So you could argue things like censorship limits, what you want to know about. You can argue who gets to decide what you're allowed to read. You can argue your understanding of the world and or that of the people you care about will be limited by those who can limit your access to information. You can also cite specific examples of harm caused, for instance, young people accessing information on issues around sexuality who might not be able to access that material, or other personal growth issues. Other issues like health matters, bias or prejudice-based limitations on access are ways you could argue pathos. And the risks of that, though, in terms of potential risks, emotional appeals can be overplayed and be off-putting. Emotional appeals can be countered with emotional appeals. So again, you might argue, I have a right to access this. Someone else can counter that by saying, well, this book is offensive to me and the group I represent. It doesn't matter if it's legal, it's demeaning to us. And that's, again, could be a convincing argument. And even more importantly, I would argue emotion can be used to mislead and manipulate. Obviously, politicians are very good at this. That's why rhetoric is still a thing. But emotional arguments can be manipulative in terms of how they're put across to try and really kind of get people to overfeel, if that's a phrase. And you have to be careful when you use those kind of arguments, I think. But I think there are bases we can use as a profession. As the example on the tables here around censorship, but you could utilize it for other different aspects of professional work. And the last category is kairos, which relates to the timing and placement of an appeal. So obviously this is relatively more straightforward. You can use specific calendar moments to argue around issues. So for instance, if you're arguing about censorship in libraries, Banned Book Week is a good week to do that, or Library Week. And you can obviously choose times that are useful if it's something that's appearing in the press. So if a topic is featuring in the press frequently or otherwise in public consciousness, then that's a good time to argue for these things. So there's a great article by Sean in the newspapers last week during Library Week that talked about a lot of these big issues. And that was a good placement period because people's eyes were on libraries. And it's a good opportunity to argue the bigger issues. Now, the potential risks of this, and this is a big one, press coverage can also highlight when libraries are seen to be censors. And that's very damaging to both future ethos and logos. Because again, if you're claiming one thing and actual libraries are doing the other, then that can become extremely dangerous for you. So there's a great quote that I utilise in the book from Ian Malley, who wrote in 1990 about censorship in libraries. And he said, paraphrasing, but he more or less said that the one thing you will find libraries and the newspapers about is normally censorship issues. And it's normally because they've handled them really badly. So I don't think that's changed. I think that's a consistent thing. And obviously newspapers have their agendas. But equally, we have to be sensible and mindful of that because we know how newspapers are going to pitch those kind of stories. especially during the so-called culture wars. So it's something to be a little bit more savvy about, I think. So this is where I'm going to shut up for a little bit and give you some work to do. So I was going to ask you to go into Zoom rooms and consider the kinds of argument you might encounter and need to respond to for the purchasing of controversial materials. You could use any example you want, and I'd like you to utilise the scale of resistance tool to consider your potential advocacy approaches. So from one side, accord, so people who agree with you, what would their views be? To people in the middle, to people at the other end who are resistant to you. What would their arguments be against the particular resource that you want to include or event you want to run? Any example you want, and how might you counter that? What would be your argument against that? So, right. So, yeah, hopefully you'll find that a useful exercise. There's lots more in the Ramage, Bean and Johnson book, and I talk quite a lot more about it in the lit review itself and in the video. So, so you might find it useful to look at how I've utilised it in the Drag Queen Story Hour arguments, and how you might unpack that to kind of make cases for initiatives. But yeah, last couple of slides really. So in terms of how I would hope they would be used, or try to kind of give some guidance on that, but obviously the literature review and the videos, these provide guidance on advocacy, on theories of rhetoric, how to apply rhetoric, you know, how you deal with different types of argument, from you know, arguments that are supportive versus arguments that are against you, looking at how the different ethical theories work, and then also how these have been applied in librarianship. And also I include some key discussions aside from that. So we talk about neutrality, we talk about the arguments for and against freedom of expression, the issue of privacy in libraries as well. So there's a lot of the big themes that we're dealing with are unpacked in greater detail. And I think I said earlier, the infographics I think could be useful for posters or bookmarks for your workplace, if you want to use them for that. Certainly things like having a poster of like Ranganathan's 5 laws or Gorman's 8 enduring values, I think might be useful in a work, maybe a kind of don't know, a staff room or something, or whatever. But it's good to remind ourselves of these values. I think often just so that we're always thinking about them. And yeah, just kind of final thoughts really. I'm obviously happy to undertake any workshops or talks for any special interest groups if that's something you think would be useful, completely gratis. Obviously I'd like people to use these materials, so if you want to do a kind of bigger workshop dealing with a lot of things that are in the materials, I'd be happy to do that. And obviously please feel free to utilise the materials as part of your own advocacy and or CPD. As I said at the beginning, it could be something, if you're revalidating or going for chartership, the materials could be useful for that, as engaging with them. You could write that as part of your CPD, I think. And obviously, hopefully, please disseminate the materials throughout your network and your organisations if you think it will be useful, to try and maximise engagement from all levels of staffs. I say for me, one of the starting points of this was, I don't think frontline staff get enough chance to engage with these issues, other than perhaps chats with colleagues. So it's good to present them with, I think, a range of what these issues mean at the higher level, so they can actually understand them even more fully and be able to have proper discussions and dialogue with users, customers, patrons, whoever we want to call them, and also politicians. I think that was it. Yeah, so I'll stop sharing the screen. Remember how to do that. Stop sharing. And yeah, just open to any questions, comments anyone has. Be happy to answer. Obviously, I've only given a small snapshot of what's in the materials, but hopefully, if you have a look, you'll see there's a lot more materials. Jill, question or comment?
Hi, yeah. Can everyone hear? Is that okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Just to reiterate what David was saying there about chartership and certification and the PKSB, I am one of CILIP Scotland's PRSOs, and the assessors have emphasised on a number of occasions that because the ethics and values area of the PKSB is at the heart and is supposed to be the basis of their entire profession, that is allowed to be one of the 10 to 12 PKSB areas that you do select for your submission and for your developmental activities. So if this is a topic that interests you, then do make use of David's resources and activities, because it really is one of the areas that the assessors are keen on that people look at.
I've
It's
put it.
also
I'm
very
going
good.
for fellowship, Jill, so I've put it for
Oh,
one of mine. So I've got it in mine for this year. So yeah.
it's also oh, totally lost my train of thought there.
Sorry.
The I'll come back to it. It
No,
was
you were saying
something
that
about the
the
PKSB
reviewers,
and
you were saying
the
the reviewers are
assessors.
interested in it. So
They are something
yeah.
about reflective writing. I'm pretty sure of it,
Okay.
but don't worry about it. We will be talking about ethics and values at all the different PKSB and PRSO activities. So hopefully see other people there. And it was a great chat, and I'm definitely going to be looking up all these resources because I'm also trying to do some professional registration myself.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jill. Sorry for interrupting you. See if I missed anything questions-wise.
I think no. I mean, I think a lot of people are very supportive in the comments. If anyone wants to add another question to there, perhaps one of the points raised around the ethical challenges of privatisation and things like that. I suppose maybe that triggered a question in my mind of a lot of people working in public libraries might not have a lot of people with library experience around them now when one of these challenges happens. So perhaps you also have to use some of these arguments with the other people in, whether it be in your immediate team or wider. And do you think that's something that might be a growing challenge, and would it be important to still apply the same rules with fellow staff?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a massive challenge. Even from my own experience, I remember going to an event about 6 years ago, a Scottish Library event, and it was heads of service thing. And I think at the time, more than half the heads of service at that point were leisure managers, which was like weird to me because I'm obviously old school. So for me, it was all librarians that were running libraries in those days. So like, but even I remember the presentation that was highlighted. I won't say what the authority was, but they were talking about how wonderful it was that during the summer they'd made so much money out of the kids reading books. And I'm like, is this an alternative universe? Is this a Twilight Zone? And I just thought, so there's little changes like that, which are not a little changes, a big change, but that kind of change in ethos, I think, is massively problematic. And I thought, who had that discussion? And why does that person think it's good to kind of present that to this audience? Something's moved, and I've not caught up with it, I guess, and hopefully never do. So yeah, those kind of changes can actually change the ethos. I think it's reinforcing why I'm so keen on people talking about these things, because, like I say, the example I cited from the newspaper article, there's nothing wrong with us getting good messages across in the newspapers, but if it looks lightweight, then it's damaging to us. If we are making statements like libraries don't censor, well, everybody knows libraries censor sometimes, right? So it looks unserious if we make statements like that. It's hard to get sound bites across, obviously, and get some sound bite. But when you do it like that way, I just think we look unserious, and it's important. The things we stand for are big things. Look, we support a lot of human rights, and those are the kind of arguments I think that we could really build on strength-wise, because libraries really are, at the core of good democracies. But when we use weak arguments, it just makes us look trivial, in my view. So I just, for me, it's about trying to get those conversations started so that everyone can have the conversations and hopefully influence those managers who maybe, and it's not their fault if they've not been exposed to our ethical values. Why should they have? They've been appointed in a certain way. So it reinforces that we need to be having those discussions, I think, and leading those discussions in our communities and in our workplaces.
Joe, did you want to come back in? I think that in your hand.
Hi, Joe.
Yeah, sure. The thing that I just really wanted to highlight was, I think that events like this are fantastic for broadening our, as a profession, experience of what other people do.
Sure.
And the focuses that other people have, the issues other people have to handle. I mean, I work in a purely private organization. I don't have any contact with the members of the public or students or anything like that. And events like this and discussions like this show you the kind of ethical dilemmas that are facing the profession every day that might not even occur to me in my workplace. But hearing people have conversations about the ethical problems that they have to meet with, again, members of the public, or being more open to, say, students or universities, I think that's really fascinating. And it is one of the things in the professional registration that people really fall down on. If ever I've heard of anybody not pass their submission successfully, it is usually because they haven't looked outwards and they haven't seen what is actually affecting more than just your little bit of the library world. And I think that research like this is hugely important for that.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, no, I 100% agree with your point there. I was external examiner for Chartership for a few years, and they got sick of me saying exactly what you'd said, because you would read all these brilliant discussions of their job, but nothing about the outward stuff. Like, well, how does what you do fit into the organisation and then wider society and all of that? And obviously some jobs you can't quite make as much of that as others. But if you work in a public library, for instance, to not talk about the impact you have on a community and all of that, I think is a massive miss. So yeah, totally 100% back you on that. I was like a broken record at every meeting saying, why aren't we encouraging this? Why aren't we encouraging this? Because for me, it's also engaging with the literature is a big bone of mine once you leave uni, you know. I had someone yesterday saying, oh, well, we don't have access. Well, you do. CILIP gives you access. You've got Lisa and you've got journals. And so, you know, but for me, CILIP don't promote that enough. That was another thing I nagged him about, was like, why don't we make that compulsory? You have to show that you've engaged with materials. And they're getting better at that with Chartership. This idea of CPD being reading and engaging with journals and things, I think is great. So the more of that we can do, engaging with resources that exist, I think the better for me.
A question in the chat, Dave, from John Vincent, and John, who you probably know, does fantastic work with Libraries of Sanctuary.
Absolutely.
And has just said that a lot of the work that he does brings out cultural war arguments. A recent example, someone on a new arrivals course thought that we shouldn't be supporting refugees, and I should definitely not be criticising the current Home Secretary.
Yeah.
And how, you know, would that be the case of someone that you can almost not win with, and you should act accordingly, or is it? Yeah,
no, John, that's an excellent point. I mean, we could kind of do this kind of navel gazing to, you know, the tool provides that kind of level of navel gazing to the nth degree, and it still might not have any effect on someone that can. I guess for me, it's about, if we are sure in our stance and we can influence other people, maybe there's a drip effect, but you're absolutely right. I mean, some of the current politicians are not wanting to be influenced. They're not thought about any of these issues in any great depth. It's literally a culture wars reaction. So you're 100% correct, John. There's some things we can't fix. But I think, for me, if we can fix ourselves, does that make sense? If we're doing everything we can do, to kind of try and at least get views across. But in terms of like not supporting refugees, that's just absurd. I mean, like, libraries have always supported refugees. It's like one of the main things public libraries have always done is been that kind of gateway for people, regardless of which country you're in. You know, they kind of learn about the culture of the country, often learn the language, engage with materials from their homeland, their own language. It's just absurd to say that they shouldn't be given access to libraries. But yeah, totally take your point on board. It's totally correct. We can only do so much, but influencing people that don't want to be influenced. And say I talk about that in the interview itself, John, because Ramage and Johnson talk about some people you can't engage with. Sadly, if those people are powerful, that's a problem. But obviously, maybe there's ways of influencing other people in the community who can give you something. But yeah, you're spot on. I agree 100%. Any other questions or queries about the materials, or anything you wanted to know about? You were unsure about how you might use them or whatever.
So these materials, just to clarify, will remain free. They'll be on our website. I know Leah's shared the link, but we'll send out an email as well later today, just so everyone has them. But yeah, and I'd imagine the culture war type challenges that inspired these may come up more as we move towards a general election in the UK. So certainly do come back to them. I think we've got another question, Nella.
Oh, vanished.
Nella, did you have your hand up? I can't hear you if you're speaking, but
oh, pardon me, I was on mute. Sorry. I was just off the back of what John was saying, sort of the example that he's given is sort of obviously a sort of a bigoted sort of point of view. And I suppose maybe in terms of, there's a sort of difference between, I think, well, at least from my understanding of the chart, is that, you know, there's some people who, sure, there's some people who are bigoted and it might not necessarily work to sort of use this chart, but there might be some people who are misinformed and have bigoted thoughts that are just misinformed, and hopefully if we were to use something like the scale of resistance, that some of those people who are simply misinformed have and who are sort of a bit more open and willing to sort of think about it might actually benefit. And I'm thinking maybe potentially that's sort of where the chart might do some good potentially.
Yeah. No, thanks, Neil. I think that's a good point. I think John's point's totally correct in terms of those people. And the issue, I think, with those people is they have a lot of power. But what they also do, I think, with that power is they influence people who maybe could be influenced by us. And I guess for me, the vacuum is us not engaging with those people. So, folk in the extremes we can't influence, but folk who are being influenced by those people in the extremes are often not hearing alternatives or not hearing it from people that they trust. And often what I see in terms of our advocacy, certainly online, is that we're out on one side of the argument constantly and not trying to kind of reach those people that can be reached. So for me, that's where we're wrong. I don't think we can influence someone like Suella Braverman at all, sadly. But people who are influenced by her, perhaps we can influence those people. And I think for me, that's why a tool, as you say, Nella, a tool like that can be useful to try and understand, well, where do we think those people's objections are coming from? Is it fear? Can we influence them with better rhetoric, better arguments, more evidence, showing that something like drag queen story time is actually a great, enjoyable thing for kids, promotes reading? Yeah, the diversity angle is important, but actually ultimately it's about promoting reading in an entertaining way. It's what children's librarians did when I was in practice, which was, they're performers, right? It's like children's librarians were always performers. So the idea that that doesn't work for kids, you're engaging them with literature, you're engaging them with stories and ideas. So often it might be the case of showing people those kind of events, how great they are, how much the kids enjoy them. But what I've seen often is librarians taking solely the equality diversity argument, which is fine, but those people that Braverman might influence might want to hear another argument. And there's nothing wrong with that. That argument is what convinces them that that's viable. We shouldn't be afraid to have those kind of discussions about, well, okay, it ticks that box, but also ticks these other boxes which you might identify with. And I talk about that in the materials, how you can meet people on the same plane. Understanding what plane you can meet them on is really important. So I couldn't get that across today because it's not a lot of time, but I do talk about that in detail in the materials, thinking about the people you can reach. But it's also clear in the materials, if people, you can't engage with some people, don't engage with them, but you need to be sure that they aren't engageable with before you discount them from an ethical standpoint.
Yeah, thank you. And another question that just Kevin's raised in the chat there, but whether, perhaps when it comes to helping refugees or any other thing that might be seen as political,
sure.
And when there's sometimes pushback from within public libraries about not being political, and I know the neutrality discussion would require a lot more time, but I guess it kind of cuts into a bit of that about how neutral we are when something could be seen as political.
Yeah, well, I'll plug the ACES conference for, probably no one's going to because it's so expensive, but I'm on a panel around neutrality at the ACES conference, because when with a couple of American colleagues, and chatting to them, they've got the same issues, arguably more powerfully having to deal with over there. But the problem with neutrality is there's a lot of things that you can criticise about it, but we haven't replaced it with anything yet. So there's like this vacuum, and that's the problem I've got. It's not that neutrality shouldn't go. There's lots of arguments for saying it should go, but you can't replace it with one version of social justice that you like, because you're excluding lots of other people, and you become something that those other people begin to think, that's not for me, that's not a good thing. So we need much more debate about what neutrality should be replaced with, that could be engaged with by more people rather than just one group. And I think hopefully we tease it out at the panel, but that's our responsibility collectively. We're not doing that work, in my view, and I think we need to be doing that work. I've reviewed lots of papers around neutrality over the past 10 years or so. I get sent quite a lot of them because it's in my area, and most of them almost like draw a cultural rear zero line. Yeah, neutrality's crap, that's it. Well, okay, well, why is it crap? What's the problems with it? Can it be fixed? If it can't be fixed, what comes after it? So in terms of I think we can be political, but we have to be political in a smart way, i.e. based on our values, not based on the values of the people that you follow on Twitter. I think that's a problem that we kind of butt against quite a lot. I think that's why I'm hopeful people engage with these materials, because if it gets a conversation started, then I'll be delighted, ultimately. If we talk more about these things collectively and listen to each other and come up with solutions that we can all kind of agree on, or certainly be respectful of, if not agree on, that we can kind of come to these kind of I hate that word journey, like using X factor, but that journey together, like that. I think that's what I'm looking for. But am I saying anything else, Sean?
No, well, apart from just lots of very positive comments saying how brilliant the resource is and looking forward to exploring it properly. And I think even having today and just the fact that we're discussing these things is really important, because I think the concern that I have is if we become fearful as a profession to discuss these things when these challenging issues come up, and scared that we might not look like we know the ethics and values, and to be comfortable with being able to just be a bit sort of more vulnerable about how well we know these things and discuss them. So I think that's been really interesting.
We're too passive, Sean. I always think I'm a big Seinfeld fan, and that kind of line in Seinfeld where it says public libraries are like government-sponsored pathetic best friends. Like, because and that's pretty much because he was talking about how oh, you're going to find me a book, oh, big deal. What, 5 pence a day, oh, big deal. And it's like that mindset. I think we're a little bit too passive with some things. We're good at some debates, but these big issues that we could really be formulating, we're kind of like always reactive to. And I go back to what I was saying in the presentation. Malley's book from 1990, where he talks about censorship in libraries, and this idea that we're only ever on the front pages when it's a censorship story that we've handled badly. Look at the summer, perfect example of that around the LGBT stuff. We handled that badly because our reaction to it was defensive, rather than okay, did something go wrong there? Can we fix it? Or because the right-wing papers are going to kind of go for anything they see as a weakness, and if we're not able to back that up because we haven't had those debates and arguments, then I think it puts us in trouble. So yeah, just about really engaging with things more collectively and having better responses that make us look more robust and more powerful as a unit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the offer David had, if any of you have groups, whether special interest groups or something similar that would like to discuss these things in more depth, and do let David or I know, and we can.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, absolutely happy to. For me, it's hopefully people want to use the materials, engage with them, and start debates and write more stuff about these things and have more. And see, the other thing I should point out, if you disagree with everything in the letter review, I don't mind. That's a good thing. So it's obviously my approach to it. You might disagree. Hopefully you don't, because I've tried to be balanced in it. But if there's things you disagree with, I'm fine with that. Engage with me on it. I don't mind. I've tried to summarise as much as I can, quite heavy things, and it's hard to do in 70 pages. But if it's a jumping off point for you, you can disagree and write something else, I'd be delighted with that. That's hopefully the way it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't have time just right now to go through all the resources, do have a look at the literature review and that kind of underpinning of it all, because that's a really good starting point before you look at the other stuff when you can schedule that. So thank you. We're almost at 1:30, so I think we'll round up there. But do let us know if anyone has any, if anyone runs into any of these types of issues, do get in touch with CILIPS, because we can always, try and either advise or also, speak to David and try and look at these resources and try and help you through any of that, because I'd imagine these things will potentially come up more often as we go forward. So just want to say thank you, David. That was really, really interesting. Thank you to everyone else for coming along today. We'll share some links, and we'll share the recording after this as well if anyone wants to catch up about that. But yeah, thanks, David, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate you coming along. It's great.